Good evening. My name is Meghla Krishnamurthy, and I'm a member of the faculty at Ashoka University, where I teach sociology and anthropology. On behalf of Ashoka University, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to Beyond the Classroom, our special series of live and interactive virtual seminars. Over the last several weeks, many of you have joined us every Saturday and Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. to hear a different member of the Ashoka faculty speak on a subject that they are passionate about, and then engage in a wide-ranging interactive discussion with you, our diverse audience. During this time of distancing and disorientation, we hope that these sessions have offered an opportunity for intellectual exchange, insight, and inspiration. They have certainly given us a way to share with you the joy, rigor, and quest for excellence that drives us all at Ashoka. Today, for the penultimate session of this extraordinary first semester of Beyond the Classroom, I am delighted to introduce you to our speaker for this evening, Avantika Bhatia, Assistant Professor of Psychology at Ashoka University. Avantika earned her Ph.D. in Counseling Psychology and her Master's in Rehabilitation Counseling, both from the University of Maryland. Her research focuses on what makes psychotherapy work, particularly the human and relational aspect of therapy. Other areas of her interest and experience include adult psychotherapy, psychodynamic therapy, working with survivors of trauma, multicultural issues, and eating disorders. This evening, she will examine attachment theory and the role it plays in our relationships and career trajectories in her seminar, Connecting the Dots, Early Emotional Bonds and Adult Experiences. Hi, Avantika.
Hi, Meghla.
It's so great to see you. And I think everybody is really looking forward to your seminar. I know I probably, like many parents, been thinking, looking at the title, wondering what these very extraordinary and peculiar times are going to mean for these children growing up now and later. And I'm sure we'll have some very exciting insights to glean from your work.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because this is a good time to share that I'm actually not a child psychologist, but I will tell you how your adult experiences are likely framed by your childhood experiences. And I'm also struggling. I'm in the same sort of boat as you, wondering, what these circumstances will lead to.
What all of it's going to mean. I know that everybody is really looking forward to the seminar. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping guidelines. Avantika will speak for about 20 minutes. And after that, you can ask your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. You can ask your questions anonymously, or you can send in your name. The choice is yours. All these sessions are being recorded and will be uploaded later on our website, and we will share the link to all the sessions with you soon. Thank you once again for joining us. And without further ado, let me turn over the screen to Avantika Bhatia.
Thank you, Meghna. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today. This is an unusual sort of a setup, but I am excited to sort of talk to you about a topic that I love dearly. As you've just heard, I teach at Ashoka University. I'm a psychologist. Along with teaching, I'm also a researcher and a psychotherapist. And, as faculty, we often have students come to us and ask us about our career trajectories, how we decided to pursue our career paths. With the PhD in particular, I often get asked about whether the length of the time sort of bothered me. And it's made me reflect actually on my postgraduate years in psychology, and while how they did feel long, how much I loved it. It also makes me sort of wonder what I was like as a child and what led me to psychology. I do know that I was a very curious child, and I know that's what we'll be sort of talking about today in terms of these sort of connections. How do our early experiences, emotional bonds in particular, contribute to how we function as adults? I also sort of think, really, what better time to be talking about attachment and emotional bonds? Like all of you, I'm also at home, physically distancing from others, feeling quite the range of emotions. I am a mother to a toddler, very much in tune with what's happening with him. I'm away from some of my family, and thus, feel what it's like to be missing them, feel the strain of separation from friends, students, colleagues. So I am very grateful for times of connecting in the way that these seminars have allowed us to do. Now, the beauty of attachment theory, and especially sort of in the current context, is that it's given me, and it continues to kind of give me, in fact, a framework of how my experiences in childhood have contributed to how I see myself as an adult, and how I see sort of relationships around me. It also has given me a framework to understand my clients, and my interest in the theory has fueled a lot of my research work. So what I hope we can get, or what I hope to offer from this session, is to share my love and excitement about this theory, and also sort of course, talk about elements of attachment theory that maybe can help you understand your own experiences as adults, or of those close to you. So let me get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So just give me a second. Okay, so in terms of how I have structured our session today, I'll begin by talking about attachment theory, and I'll describe what it is. I'll also talk about individual differences that we see in attachment styles in children, with the caveat again that I'm not a child psychologist. My work is primarily with adults, but I will provide an overview of attachment in childhood that can really pave the way for us to understand attachment in adulthood. I'll then move on to talk about attachment in adults, focusing on evidence, mechanisms through which we really carry forward these bonds from childhood. And also I'll share some areas of research happening with my research team of students at Ashoka University. So let me get started and jump in. Okay, so I've used the term attachment a few times now, and I'm sure you're probably wondering, what is it that I mean? What is attachment to begin with? So attachment theory was developed by John Bowlby in the 1940s as a way of understanding how we begin to form emotional bonds in our early years, and how these emotional bonds really set the stage for what's to come. You can see a quote here from Bowlby on emotional bonds. In line with this quote, Bowlby talked about how we all as mammals are born with the capacity to form emotional bonds, right? So Bowlby actually developed attachment theory as a result of observations of young mammals' behaviors following separation from their caregivers. So what do I mean by this? I can guarantee that in a second, you all will see that you have had experience with these separation behaviors. Maybe some of you can remember a time when you took care of a puppy, or you were like the puppy sort of primary kind of caretaker, and how this puppy sort of followed you around, whined incessantly when you left. I have to say I've had that experience. Mothers of young toddlers such as myself know only too well what it means when we leave our toddlers, right? What it means to kind of even start facilitating that separation, right? So we've all sort of seen these kind of behaviors. Maybe we've even heard our parents share memories of how we cried as children when they left. So it's really kind of almost part of our narrative when we describe child behavior, to talk about these instances of separation. And that's really what Bowlby kind of picked up on, that these behaviors were sort of common across species. How does this sort of tie in with emotional bonds? So these observations on attachment behaviors led Bowlby to believe that we all have these inbuilt attachment systems through which we look for safety and comfort from people who are older and wiser. So this attachment system, very interesting, it works like a regulator. So it goes up at times of threat and causes the child to sort of reach out for safety, typically, again, to the primary caregiver. Once the child feels safe, they then get a sense of security that allows them to kind of explore their world. So again, let me sort of highlight this with an example that I'm sure all of you are sort of familiar with. So imagine that if we're at a social gathering, we see a mother walk in with her child sort of sees all these new people, gets a bit nervous, perceives some sort of threat, attachment system goes up, right? Child then starts showing attachment behaviors, clings to the mother, maybe asks for the mother, stays close to the mother. This is really, again, the child reaching out for that sense of safety from the mother. Once the child sort of feels safe, we've also seen that sense of security kind of comes in. And then very beautifully, we go see that the child starts sort of exploring slowly at first and then more later their surroundings. So they're really using the mother in this case as the secure base through which they're exploring the world, right? So this is sort of how the attachment system gets activated, the parent sort of responds, and then it builds a sense of security in the child. What is key here also is how parents respond to the child's needs of safety. Now, this is not to say for, again, parents who might be watching this, that every need has to be responded to. That is not possible. But what Bowlby really talked about, or what the theory talks about, is the importance of being attuned to what's happening with the child, to understanding sort of what's happening with the child, what might be causing sort of the distress, being sort of aware of this distress, and then responding appropriately, given sort of what the situation is to the child, right? Now, are there differences? Oh, actually, let me just mention also over here that it is sort of this response of parents and this interplay with the child seeking safety and comfort and the parent sort of responding that creates these first emotional bonds that we see in children, right? Now, are there differences in the ways that children experience the responsiveness of attachment figures and how they express their attachment behaviors? We know actually from research that was conducted by Bowlby's colleague that yes, there are differences. Through a range of studies, Ainsworth and now many others have found that most children actually tend to show secure attachment patterns. And what this means is the child experiences distress or shows attachment behaviors when the attachment system is activated, say at times of separation from their primary caregiver. But then they're also able to get comforted and soothed appropriately, right? So in a very sort of famous set of experiments, the child is with the primary caregiver leaves, child is with a stranger, and then the primary caregiver comes back. This is sort of in a lab setting, which allows us to kind of see how the child is behaving when the caregiver leaves and when the caregiver comes back. And we know for the majority of the children, they show signs of distress when the caregiver comes back. They're excited to see the caregiver, they move towards the caregiver, they show behaviors of engagement with the caregiver, all indications of secure attachment. But we also see that research has indicated that smaller groups of children may show insecure attachment patterns, which are typically associated with needs not being met in ways that are consistent. Unlike secure attachment, where caregivers tend to be sort of sensitive and responsive to the needs of young ones. Now, what is really fascinating also about this is that there's a significant now body of evidence that has followed these children through their early years into adulthood to get a sense of how these patterns play out, which kind of brings us to why do we care? Why do we care? What does it matter if we see these patterns in early childhood? Well, we see actually that attachment security in childhood leads to some pretty interesting outcomes in childhood. These are outcomes such as, so secure children tend to have good relationships with their peers, healthy relationships with their peers. They also tend to get favorable sort of feedback from their teachers. And for some of you who might find this interesting, they tend to do better in tests, in standardized tests, in math exams, things like that, right? More so as compared to children who are insecurely attached. And this is after controlling for things like IQ, right? So I'll talk about how this works in a minute. But also, the other thing we see is that the research has kind of indicated that we do actually carry patterns of secure attachment that are set in our very early years, say from 1 year on, into adulthood. And a main area where we actually see this is in romantic relationships, because romantic relationships often then represent attachment figures, right? Where the person is then able to kind of bring in their attachment experiences, are more likely to kind of notice attachment systems being activated, and then how those kind of play out in that relationship. I'm sure some of you who maybe are not in the line of psychology may have heard terms such as, oh, that person is so insecure in that relationship, in a romantic relationship. That person is so worried about being left, right? Like, or broken up with, or that person is clingy. And all of these sort of terms that we use that are not necessarily appropriate at all, but they do have some bearings in how, in understanding that we are utilizing romantic relationships, or seeing romantic relationships as attachment sort of templates in our later lives, in our adult lives. Now, I have a pet peeve here that I want to share that I think a lot of psychologists will want to share or believe in, is that when we talk about these relationships, these are all based on probability, based on the data and the evidence that we have. These are not deterministic relationships. So what I mean is that we cannot say that just because a child has a secure attachment pattern or a style as a 1-year-old, that they will definitely go on to look like this as they become an adult, right? That's not something that psychologists can claim based on this sort of evidence. But what we can say is that it increases the likelihood that it really creates a framework through which the child is then able to explore relationships in a way that feels sort of more secure for the child, right? So I just want to sort of point that out. I know there's a lot of talk around misinformation and things getting quoted in a way that's not accurate. And this is something that psychologists really work on, is to make sure that we are using the data and evidence correctly. Okay, so I've sort of shared this in terms of why we care and what the evidence is, that really attachment security relates to outcomes that we would expect, like relationships, but also things that we don't expect or didn't naturally kind of expect, like test scores. How does this happen, or how does this play out? So I want to mention two mechanisms here. The first is internal working models. So one way in which these attachment patterns sort of carry forth into our experiences, even as adults, are through these internal working models. Internal working models are basically these mental representations that start getting formed as a result of our early attachment experiences. These mental representations are about how we think about ourselves and how we think about others, according to attachment theory. So again, let me give you an example here. So say we have a 1-year-old girl, right? Typically, this girl has felt that her mother and her father or her caregivers have really responded to her needs, right? She has grown up with this sense of security in her close relationships. What does this mean for how she thinks about herself? So likely, she is going to think about herself as deserving of love and care. She will believe that I am deserving of love and care, which is sort of given to me. And in terms of others, she is likely to think about others as people who are close to me, will provide me with comfort in a way that feels appropriate, in a way that feels that I can sort of take it in. Right now, this may be very different from somebody who has more of, say, an insecure attachment style, which is more avoidant, which might be that I don't need to be close to anyone if needs are sort of not met earlier in life. Say this child is grown up with negligence. I don't need anybody to take care of me, and others can't be trusted. Right? So you can see there's a very different framework that gets internalized based on these attachment experiences and how parents respond or caregivers respond early in life. And what internal working models sort of tell us is that these experiences and these experiences sort of get get coded as these mental representations, and then we navigate our other relationships through these mental representations, right? So we might approach our romantic relationships in a way that's similar. I trust my romantic partner to be there for me, versus I don't believe that my romantic partner will be there for me as a result of our own experiences. The other way that I also think is fascinating in terms of how attachment really sort of plays a role in carrying forth patterns is through emotional regulation. And let me sort of explain this a little bit. So when we talk about attachment security, again, remember we talked about sort of behaviors. Child gets upset, shows signs of distress, maybe fear, and then the parent responds to these emotions. Now, if the parent is able to sort of hold these emotions, understand these emotions, respond to these emotions, likely the child is going to feel soothed and comforted. And eventually the child will then learn to kind of comfort themselves, right? Which leads us to emotional regulation. So securely attached children tend to be good about regulating their emotions. They learn through their attachment experiences how to regulate their emotions. And this again may look very different for insecure attachment styles, where one might feel a level of distress that is not able to kind of get soothed, right? Might feel a level of distress where the person feels really kind of stuck with that level of distress. So this brings us to our test scores, that what's likely happening in these instances is that in anxiety provoking situations or stress inducing situations like tests, securely attached kids can say, I got this, I'm feeling really stressed out, but it's okay. I know that I feel stressed, but I know I can manage that stress. And they're able to kind of regulate themselves more so than children who might be insecurely attached. And we also notice again that this carries forth into our patterns as adults. I'm again going to use the example of romantic relationships here. If one feels really sort of overwhelmed, the idea with secure attachment is not that they don't feel, they feel, but there's more of a handle on, I can manage this feeling, or I can get support for this feeling. I can rely on others to help me with this feeling. With somebody with more sort of insecure attachment pattern may not be able to kind of access, right? They might either shut down, I don't want to feel this anymore, and might pull away, or they might sort of sit with it and then really get stuck with feeling sad and overwhelmed and not really know how to take in support that could help them. So these are two ways in which we find that attachment experiences actually carry forward into our adult lives. Now, what is also interesting now with this is that we can see that attachment experiences then have so much sort of scope in helping us understand various reactions as a result of various experiences in adulthood, right? Now, this could be, I have a few examples here, but really we find that it can be applied to many different contexts. A few examples that I've already sort of put here is one, attachment experiences to help us understand reactions of grief and loss. So if you think about it, loss or losing somebody is really the highest level of separation that there can be, right? So which really kind of activates the person's attachment system. So depending on what we know about internal working models, emotional regulation, attachment patterns, early experiences, we might be able to understand, is the person going to feel really stuck at certain points in the grief process? Are they going to be able to look for support when they need it? Are they going to be able to get comforted by this support? Are they going to shut down? So that's how we might make sense of these grief and loss experiences through an attachment framework. I've already given a few examples here in our session today around breakups. I know as a therapist, very often I will work with people coming in who've expressed endings or pain as a result of romantic endings. Really helps again to bring in an attachment framework to understand what's happening around these endings. Is the person sort of blaming themselves? So the internal working models of, I'm not good enough to be in this relationship. Is the person sort of feeling shut down, or is the person sort of saying that I'm feeling a lot of pain, but I also know that I'm relying on other forms of care or comfort to get me through this time, which is more a sign of security. To mental health. So things such as it helps psychologists, psychotherapists understand how we can kind of look into symptoms of depression. Very often, those who are experiencing depression will we'll see sort of these internal working models of themselves that might be more attacking towards oneself, around not feeling good enough or more self-critical. Now, again, remember, this is all probabilistic depending on what type of depression, how long it's existed for. But perhaps somebody who is experiencing depression, I can maybe as a therapist gauge that their internal working models are actually strong. I mean, they're saying that I know that this is not sort of what I deserve, right? That gives me a very different picture of what might be happening with someone as compared to somebody who says that I'm really not good enough. And that's a very sort of core experience that I have. And that goes into these internal working models related to insecurity. Three other points that I want to bring up here that I thought I would talk about today, that we've been looking at, like I mentioned, with my research team of students at Ashoka University, career development, maternal mental health, and psychotherapy. And let me tell you a little bit about how attachment has informed some of our research in these areas. So the first area that I'll talk about is career development. In this, a student who's working with me, a master's level student, Simran Rana, and we were interested in understanding female students' career aspirations, right? And part of our reasoning for this is that we are noticing that the numbers with which female students are enrolled in educational institutions is not really getting reflected in leadership positions, right? So we wanted to understand at this point at an undergraduate level, when female students do start developing their career aspirations, how can we sort of understand better what's contributing to these career aspirations? Given my interest in attachment and sort of Simran's ideas, we also wondered if attachment could play a role here for these female undergraduate students. So a study looked at 159 female undergraduate students. We are still in the process of collecting data. We looked at attachment to both the mother as well as the father. And what we found is that attachment to the mother, so secure attachment to the mother, actually related to greater career aspirations. So the extent to which young female undergraduate students were experiencing a secure kind of bond with their mothers was contributing to something like career aspirations. Again, something that we would not expect perhaps to see a very direct link in. We also kind of thought about this further and wondered, okay, what might be the mechanism, what might be a variable that helps us understand this? And going back to these internal working models of the self, we looked at self-esteem. And we found then that as we had hypothesized that the attachment to the mother really contributes to a greater sense of self-esteem, which in turn then relates to greater career aspirations, right? So it's interesting because it's telling us that when we're looking at career aspirations of undergraduate female students, we need to kind of go beyond just the career sort of related variables, but maybe also understand what's happening in their interpersonal lives. What is also very interesting that I think some of you will find, at least some of you will find interesting here, is that we don't see this connection with attachment to fathers. So we didn't see a connection between secure attachment to fathers and career aspirations in female undergraduate students in our sample, and we didn't see the link with self-esteem. Now, I am both fascinated and a bit disgruntled by this finding. I am wondering sort of what's happening here and sort of reasons or mechanisms we could try and look into in the future. One way of thinking about this is perhaps attachment to the father plays out in a different way and not through career aspirations. When we think about career development, we also don't have a male sample yet that we've looked at. So maybe that will shed some lights on this. Also, of course, makes me wonder in an Indian context, if we are still really looking at mothers as these central primary kind of caregivers who are, providing these bonds through which we can securely kind of explore different career paths, look to different sort of career aspirations and things like that. So we can't, of course, make these inferences based on the data that we have, but we are excited to pursue this in the future. Okay, next area of research that we've also been looking at is maternal mental health. This is again something that is very close to my heart, that I feel very strongly about. I have a quote here from Bowlby on, if a community values its children, it must cherish its parents, cherish their parents. So what we want to do here is actually look at what's happening with mothers during pregnancy and postpartum. And what we actually know is that in India, mothers do tend to be the primary caregivers, and thus are the ones responsible for responding to the infant's needs to create secure attachment. So if we do want to promote secure attachment in our communities at large, we need to understand and really direct our attention to what's happening with mothers at these very sensitive times, right? Where mothers are also experiencing loss of certain identities, gaining of new identities, to try and see how can we unpack all of this to help understand their experiences. What our research has focused on is also looking at some self-oriented variables as well as interpersonal variables when we think about maternal mental health at this point. Possible implications of this, we are hoping, could be the OBGYN really sort of looking at some of these as ways to sort of screen for well-being, for things like depression and anxiety during these times, for also therapists to be attuned to a more holistic understanding of what's happening during pregnancy and after. Okay, and then finally, I come to psychotherapy. Psychotherapy, as I mentioned earlier, I am a therapist. I find that attachment theory and research have really kind of influenced the way that I approach my clinical work. So over here, I want to talk as a researcher, but I'll also talk as a therapist in terms of how I have been able to use this in therapeutic work. So Bowlby actually, who was a psychoanalyst before he moved on to talk about attachment theory and thus was a psychotherapist, talked about the therapist as a secure base. So this I find so beautiful because it really tells us that the therapist then becomes the attachment figure for people who are coming in for therapy, right? So in this way, then the therapist then becomes this safe haven for the person to bring in their attachment behaviors, maybe express attachment behaviors at times when the attachment system is activated. And then hopefully, if they're able to kind of get this sense of security, use a therapist as a secure base to explore what's happening out in relationships outside. So an example over here might be, say a client who comes to work with me who has a lot of trouble expressing anger, right? Has either sort of not been able to express anger in a way that felt healthy or meaningful in previous relationships, maybe has had a history of anger in early experiences, and thus has not been able to really ever share anger in relationships. If they're able to sort of express that anger towards the therapist in a way that feels safe to them, if the therapist is able to kind of hold that anger, they might actually then go on to very appropriately express anger in their relationships outside. So that's sort of how this dynamic would work. And I can say, again, through my clinical experiences, that I have found this to be enormously valuable. We can also use attachment related sort of experiences in therapy, as I sort of have indicated earlier, in understanding people's experiences more deeply. So looking at things like, again, loss and responses to separation, to transitions. I know I work with university students sometimes who where this idea around sort of how people adapt to transitions and separations from families, that sort of plays a role here. So these attachment theory can give us the way of understanding these experiences. And another point that I want to mention here that some of my research has looked at is how the therapy relationship can also help us understand how we process endings through an attachment perspective. So how ending a therapeutic relationship, which we call termination, really allows all of the muckiness that we associate with loss to come into that space, and allows the therapist to then work with these mucky, messy reactions associated with that loss. And then what a great way to really start reframing some of the attachment frameworks that might have existed from years prior through therapy. Right. So I know I get the question often around, can attachment patterns or styles change? And the answer to that is yes, they can change. One of the ways, of course, is through therapy. And then finally, I just want to talk about, go back to where we started and talk about our current circumstances, where we are navigating such a new landscape of new relationships, a new way of managing relationships through working online or prolonged periods of separation, more sort of stressors that I'm sure a lot of our activation systems are actually really off the charts and activated right now. So I hope, this talk gives you a way to kind of think about what's coming up for you. Do you find yourself feeling overwhelmed by these reactions? Are you able to kind of monitor this? Is it triggering some mental representations that you have of yourself, of the world, of others? And maybe this theory and some of the stuff that I've talked about here will help you make sense of these experiences. Okay, so I think I am at the end of my talk part here. I do want to thank the Beyond the Classroom team for approaching me and for letting me talk about something that I feel so strongly about. I also want to thank my students as part of my research team at Ashoka University. I am constantly pushed intellectually to answer their questions. I really enjoy sort of the work that we're doing together. It keeps me really excited about sort of research. And I want to thank Ashoka University for their support. And of course, all of you all who have been here on a Saturday night listening to me talk about something that I care deeply about. And now I just want to introduce Simran Rana. Simran Rana will be joining us today as our moderator for our questions that I see you have been sending. Simran has actually done the study that I was talking about on career development. We've been working together for the past year. I have loved working with Simran. I'm so excited to have her be the moderator for our questions today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I think this has been a wonderful session. I keep thinking about how my attachment to my parents and my siblings have played out in the friendships and relationships I have. And I think that it's a topic that the more I keep thinking about, the more ideas I get about, oh, this could be the reason why. And I hope that our audience also felt the same. So we've had a lot of questions and we thought that we might separate them by theme so that we can get through as many as possible. The first one is about what role do siblings play in developing attachment bonds as children?
Yeah, so very interesting question. So Bowlby's sort of work had to do more with really looking to someone older and wiser, which were the words that he used for that sense of safety. But what we also find, and I think I didn't mention this in my session, but we also find when we look at adult experiences and why it becomes complicated in adulthood, and we don't see these very distinct attachment styles in adulthood, is because we are really looking at the sum total of all our attachment experiences. So it may be, within older sibling maybe who's able to kind of provide some of these safety and security needs. It may be as a result of grandparents, especially in collectivist cultures where we see that there can be more than one primary caregivers, nannies, all of these. So it might be like a sum total of all of these experiences that really play into adulthood. So I would imagine not a younger sibling just in terms of the way the theory is structured, but an older sibling could be possible, yes.
Okay. Our next question is, do we tend to remember our negative memories of childhood more prominently than pleasant ones?
So I don't know if this really fits in with attachment theory. Let me see if I can try and make a link here. Why I'm also sort of intrigued is there is so much research on memories and really a lot of research that tells us that memories are not accurate at all. But from an attachment theory point of view, one would not really be considered so much with the absolute facts, but more how the person is also taking in some of these experiences. But I don't see any evidence as I'm thinking about it through an attachment lens of negative memories playing a bigger role than positive memories. Again, I think at least from an attachment perspective, it would be sort of the sum total of these experiences. So the sum total of the experiences indicate that that needs are being responded to, that would lead to more positive internal working models.
All right. So it seems like when we look at attachment in adulthood, it seems to be an aggregated view rather than trying to see which person or which relationship was most important. Which brings me to the next question is that when we're adults, how do we measure our attachment as children? What do we use?
When we're adults, how we measure attachment in children. Yeah, so as psychologists, we use a number of different measures. We do have measures that look at attachment in romantic relationships. Again, like I said, as attachment figures. We do have, so this study, in your study, what we used was a measure of attachment. So it's a self-report of how one is feeling in terms of their attachment bonds currently with the mother, with the father, with a romantic partner, with a friend, which gives us some insight into current attachment patterns. There is also the adult attachment interview, which looks at, which is a more complicated way of getting an attachment, but a really thorough way, which helps, which is an interview that one does with adults to get a sense of how their attachment experiences were organized. So again, it's more on how the person is understanding their attachment experiences now, rather than really going back in time to figure out what happened. It's more about how the person takes in these experiences.
Okay. The next question is about adopted children and whether they carry the void of their first separation, even though they might be very young and may not have a developed memory. And how does this impact them as adults?
Yeah, I think this is another great question. And I actually think Bolvi did some work and actually began some of his journey looking at adoption. I imagine what attachment theory would say that these paths are not fixed, right? So I think like I indicated earlier, it doesn't mean that if one has a history of separation, that they can never go on to develop secure attachment or secure bonds. It does mean, again, that it does set the stage a little bit, but if it's followed by bonds that lead to or lend themselves to security and are responsive, we find that these patterns change. It may take a little bit more time as someone gets older, and if they've had a long history of no sort of secure kind of relationships in the way that we're talking about with attachment. I've certainly seen that, as I mentioned, in therapy. So definitely with adoption, I think the idea would be what's happening in their current sort of home environments in terms of meeting sort of responsive and being responsive to the child's needs. Oh, Simran, I am not able to hear you.
Sorry. This next question is by Monica Kamath, and she asks about whether some attachment styles can lead to some leadership styles, and has there been any research around this? And can it help inform us more about leadership development?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm actually, to be very honest, this is my leadership area is not my area. My general sense is that attachment has found its way into almost everything that psychologists study in all of these different lines. So I think it's very interdisciplinary. I would be happy to look up some resources. If you said Monica, Kamath, like if you want to get in touch with me, I'd be happy to sort of guide you. I think this is an interesting question. So this is as far as the research is concerned. If I was to theorize, I would imagine that the answer would be that security would predict better leadership. I'm not familiar again with leadership styles, but if you think about somebody who's secure, they are somebody who, they are people who are able to kind of manage other people's emotions, right? Don't get overwhelmed by what somebody else might be bringing in. They are in sort of tune with what's happening with others, with what's happening with them. They're able to kind of ask for support when they need. They know sort of when they need to ask for support. So in general, I would imagine that theoretically security would tie in with leadership styles that can be helpful.
Our next question is about whether attachment styles can change over our lifetime. And you said that you have. I
Mhm.
thought I'd link this up with another question that said, is it possible for us to work on our own attachment, identify it as adults, and how do we do it if we don't have a therapist?
Yeah, I really love this question. Like, I think I began by saying that it's really helped me. I think some things that I can say is when one is feeling very activated, and I think this was actually told to me by a supervisor, and I found so helpful to think about it in this way, that if you're feeling very activated, or if you're really noticing signs of, okay, my attachment system is sort of on high alert right now. I'm feeling a lot of separation anxiety. I feel like I'm going to get abandoned, or I feel like I'm shutting down. Those may be sort of the cues for us to sort of look into ourselves and understand what's happening here. You know, is this really about the relationship? Do I have enough evidence to say that this is about the relationship, or is this about something more? Is this about how I normally approach all relationships? Am I noticing a pattern here? And then maybe try and find ways to see what can help just take that thermostat or regulator down, you know, whatever that might be for that particular person. So I do think it is possible to work on some of these, or at least to build awareness on some of these patterns that can help one outside of therapy.
And next question is again about adult relationships. Can two people who have insecure attachment styles have a healthy long-term relationship?
So there has been a lot of research on romantic relationships and pairings. Um, I guess it would depend on what one considers healthy. Sometimes, if we think about maybe two people who generally tend to shut down, come together, maybe there's sort of safety there. So maybe the relationship doesn't feel as tumultuous, right? But if we look closer, we might also see that the couple may not really be looking to each other for the support that they might need, right, in the process of being kind of shut down, or being of feeling safe in roles where one doesn't really have to share much emotionally. So I can imagine, and I'm sure there's been sort of research on this, so there's certain pairings where we may not notice intense emotions, but I'm not sure if that would necessarily be healthy in the way that we think about emotional relationships, where one can express emotions, get support when needed, and be there. But it may be something that might work for some people, right? Till the point where it feels like something is not working about that. I also want to mention here that attachment theory has really found its way into working with couples as well. So there are a lot of psychotherapists who do couples work and romantic relationship work specifically, that use an attachment informed perspective.
Okay. And are psychologists better able to regulate their effects of attachment styles as adults?
I don't know if one has a general kind of answer to this. I think it would depend, of course, on the psychologist's experiences. A lot of my research is on the psychotherapy relationship. So I love talking about some of the stuff that psychotherapists get into the room that can feel very unresolved for psychotherapists. But I think with good training, what happens is that the therapist is more able to, again, recognize some of this and has more awareness of this. So again, whether we are securely attached or insecurely attached, even in our early experiences, we all tend to have an attachment system that gets high at times, or the thermostat regulator kind of goes up. But with good training, therapists are more able to kind of recognize when this regulator is going up and are able to kind of monitor their levels and engage in strategies to bring that back down. But I wouldn't say that this is true across the board.
Okay, our next question is from Pooja Haldia, and she asks whether the nature-nurture question, how much of our attachment is due to our genetic makeup and how much because of our early childhood experiences?
Yeah, so again, great question. So I would say this would be a critique of attachment theory, that some folks say that there is more emphasis given on nurture here. What research has actually shown us is that infants' temperament, for example, and that's sort of linked to nature in terms of what the infant is born with, does not really tie in with attachment styles. It's more how the parent responds to that particular temperament. So again, with most things in psychology, the research kind of points towards an interaction, but attachment theory is based on the premise that we all have this innate kind of system. So there's an evolutionary system that's built within us, which is this attachment system that gets activated. But a lot of what happens with that really depends on parents' responsiveness. So it does place more emphasis on nurture in that way.
Okay, the next question is about the current times and situation that we live in. Do these times carry the potential of bringing about a reversal and lead to over-attachment due to prolonged period of physical containment?
I'm sure there'll be tons of data coming up from this time. I mean, this is such an unusual time. I know in the field of psychology, there is absolutely an interest in trying to understand what the implications of what we've been calling physical distancing and sort of social distancing, what the implications might be. Again, see, if I think about it more from a theory point of view, I think it would depend on parents, really, in terms of how they're able to respond or not respond to the child's needs. I imagine that it might be for some parents, especially parents who also maybe had experiences of attachment that have been or led to sort of insecurities earlier. Maybe in those cases something gets triggered and maybe then they jump in more, but a lot of this will depend on how the parent is sort of coping right now. So I think this also sort of speaks to, going back to maternal mental health, really the importance of parents really taking care of themselves and making sure that they are getting their needs met to be able to kind of meet the needs of children.
And do you think that early emotional bonds and adult experiences are gendered? So are our emotional expressions also gendered?
We do see a lot of cross-cultural research on attachment styles. Now, again, this is a little beyond my area. Like I mentioned, I don't do work with children. As far as I know, we don't have evidence really of attachment being gender dependent. There is some new sort of research coming up in terms of, do we expect, or do we, for example, say with crying, are there certain emotions or emotional experiences which culturally sort of feel okay or not okay, which might then lead to or contribute to the way in which attachment patterns develop culturally. But I would say that the research in these areas is still relatively new. I mean, I don't believe that we have tapped into all areas. So maybe there's more to be said here, but just off what we have now, I don't believe that there are gender differences as such.
Okay. And can attachment theory also explain mental health issues that one might struggle with as an adult?
Yes, absolutely. So I had given the example of depression. So if, and this is again not true for everybody who experiences depression or all forms of depression, but it is helpful to understand when we're thinking about depression, how is this person really structuring how they think about themselves in terms of their internal working models, in terms of how they feel about themselves, do they feel like they're not good enough in some form or way, others won't respond to them, and that can give us some more insight here. It is linked in many ways to many mental health concerns. One area, that is another big area, is borderline personality disorder, where we find a very specific type of attachment, which I haven't talked about in today's session, called disorganized attachment, that is linked with borderline personality disorder in adults.
Okay. So we've had over 1,000 people tuning in today. Thank you. The previous question was by Sanjay Deshpande, and one last question that maybe we could end with is that does attachment style also predict our personality? So how would we rate on introversion or extroversion?
Mm-hmm. So it does predict dimensions of our personality. What Bolvi would also say is that part of that changes through adult experiences. So while we get a framework to understand personality, and it really kind of sets the stage for certain personality variables, we are also kind of looking at how things are changing. Um, uh, I know that we have to stop, and if we do have more questions, I just want to mention that please do feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the Ashoka website. If I didn't answer your question or well enough, or you have follow-up questions or need resources, I'd be very happy to direct your attention to them.
All right, thank you so much. We had over 380 questions, and I think we tried to do our best to pack in as many as possible. Thank you so much, Professor. I really had a great time, and I hope that our audience did too.
Thank you, Simran, for agreeing to moderate the session, for asking me these questions that I really enjoyed answering. Thank you all to everybody who's here, for your questions, for staying with me through this time. I am, very happy to have been able to do this. Okay. Good night.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us throughout the session. Please stick on for another 5 minutes so that you can fill out our survey. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you for sending in so many questions. Please join us next Wednesday for our last session as the semester comes to a close. So our 12th seminar will be on Wednesday at 8:30, and we'll be joined by a new faculty member with an interesting new topic. Please do follow us on social media and keep an eye out in your inbox. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a great night.